Well, what a crowd. This is fantastic. I'm Lynn Walker. I am a member of the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory Foundation Board, that's a mouthful, and I am sponsoring today's talk. As evidenced by this slide of my collection, I just love Roadrunners. I think they're the most fascinating and mysterious of all our desert wildlife. Well, okay, I don't have a collection of 8x10 glossy photos of him on my nightstand. I just love Jim Cornett. Jim Cornett has studied the Roadrunner for 15 years, and he's sharing what he's learned with us today and in a new expanded second edition of his book, The Greater Roadrunner. Jim holds both a BA and MS degrees in biology and is the founder and principal biologist for JWC Ecological Consultants, an ecological consulting firm specializing in endangered species studies in the deserts of the American Southwest. With 36 science and natural history books to his credit, he is one of the Southwest's best-known naturalists. So please join me in welcoming Jim Cornett.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Great turnout this afternoon. I was told that I should say something offensive so that a few people would leave. I haven't decided what I should say yet, so that remains to be seen. I'm talking about Roadrunners today, and hopefully I'll tell you everything you've ever wanted to know about what I claim is the most popular bird in America. I should tell you that the Joshua Tree National Park Association is responsible for much of the research I've been doing on Roadrunners, and I have to tell you that I have found out that Roadrunners are almost human. And I'm going to give lots of examples of that as we proceed through that today. Now, the first thing I want to mention is a study I did in Washington, D.C. In 1994, I was brought to Washington, D.C. to testify on behalf of science in the California deserts because Congress was considering the Desert Protection Act, which eventually was passed. And we would lobby congressmen for passage of the bill in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we had the entire afternoon off. So I went out onto the streets of Washington, D.C., and I got information so that I can tell you that America's best-known bird is the Roadrunner. I asked 35 people who appeared to be looking, well, it's not a big sample size, but 35 people, and I showed them these two photographs, one of the Roadrunner and one of the bald eagle on the right-hand side of the screen there, and I asked them to identify each bird. 2/3 of the people correctly identified the Roadrunner, and only 1/3 of the people correctly identified the bald eagle, which is on our national emblem. And that was enough for me to claim that the Roadrunner is the best-known bird in America. Now, what I'll be talking about today are some of the things that almost all of you know. It's running speed, very fast for a bird, 18 miles an hour, devours venomous snakes, and, of course, the cartoon. And I want to point out right now that there's a lot of errors in the cartoon. The feet have 3 toes. Roadrunners have 4. This shows that the wings are purple and the top knot is purple. That's not true. And the bird is green, which is another error. So the cartoon has lots of mistakes, but I think the cartoon has gone a long way towards making Roadrunners very popular. They're also used in the names of a lot of businesses. In fact, I once got a telephone operator, long-distance telephone operator, to break the rules. She spent a half hour with me going through all the telephone directories in the entire country. We found over 1,000 businesses who used the Roadrunner name or the logo that she could see on her computer to just show you how popular the Roadrunner really is. So all kinds of businesses: Roadrunner Realty, Roadrunner draperies and mini blinds, vertical blinds, all kinds of things. Native Americans, if we go back in time, they were well aware of the Roadrunner. Take a look at this. Here is a petroglyph of a Roadrunner. See the long bill, the head crest, the long tail, X-shaped feet, and I'll talk about that in a second. These are all characteristics of Roadrunner, so there's no question that this is a petroglyph of a Roadrunner. Petroglyph etched in that rock surface more than 800 years ago. This particular petroglyph was discovered by Lou Kingman in a very unusual way. We had 8 people go into the McCoy Mountains about 100 miles east of Palm Springs, and we were looking at all the petroglyphs. There were over 3,000 petroglyphs there, and we were searching for just one that showed the Roadrunner. We spent 2 days examining over 1,000 petroglyphs. There were 8 people. We couldn't find a single Roadrunner petroglyph. So we're now walking out of the McCoy Mountains. Lou Kingman, one of the 8 people, he said, "Jim, I need to go over by myself. I have to relieve myself." And so Lou left the group. We're walking back to the cars, and suddenly Lou screams out, Jim, you got to come over here and see this." And there, where Lou had stopped to relieve himself, he found this petroglyph. So he discovered it quite by accident. If you go to other areas, this is in the Chihuahuan Desert of southern New Mexico. Here's another Roadrunner petroglyph with the same head crest, X-shaped foot, long tail, and a long bill, all characteristics of Roadrunners. The Hopi Roadrunner Kachina, some of you may be knowledgeable about Kachina dolls, and here is one of them called the Roadrunner Kachina dolls. What's really interesting to note is that Roadrunners don't live anywhere near the closest Hopi Indians, so it must have been legend and rumor that got to the Hopis that described a bird which they eventually made a Kachina doll out of, in spite of none of them having ever seen one. Okay, so what is a Roadrunner? All right, Roadrunners are birds. That's pretty obvious to everybody, but what you might not know is that because it's a bird, it's a descendant of a dinosaur. Dinosaurs never became extinct, they became birds, and they survive in great numbers and great diversity around the world. Now, in terms of the kind of bird, well, the Roadrunner is a cuckoo. It has nothing to do with its odd behavior. It's a member of a bird family known as the Cuculidae. And there are some other birds that are in that group. The closest relative, by the way, of any member of the cuckoo family would be parrots. Parrots also have that X-shaped foot pattern. So a couple other of its close relatives that live in the United States, although albeit in the very southern portion of the United States, would be the groove-billed Annie and then the yellow-billed cuckoo that you see here. What I like about this bird is that it has the same light and dark markings on its long tail that you would see in a Roadrunner. It also has the X-shaped feet, the downward curved bill, all characteristics of the cuckoo family of birds. So it is a cuckoo. Let's see, there we go. Now, this you might not know. There's actually 2 kinds of Roadrunners. There's the lesser Roadrunner, which I'm not interested in because it's a lesser bird. And then the Greater Roadrunner, which is the one we have around here in the Coachella Valley. 2 species of Roadrunners, and Geococcus velox is the lesser Roadrunner, Geococcus californianus is the Greater Roadrunner, and I should tell you that they're as closely related as they can be without being the same thing. Here's the lesser Roadrunner. It's about 2/3 the size of our Greater Roadrunner, and it lives only in Mexico. It isn't found in the United States. If we go back in time, there was once a larger Roadrunner called Conklin's Roadrunner. During the Ice Age, it was much larger than the Greater Roadrunner that we have today. Just to show you how big it actually was, as you can see, it wasn't that big. It was about 50% larger than the Roadrunner we have today in the Coachella Valley. Anyway, here's the ranges of these birds. This is the Greater Roadrunner in the gray, and then the lesser Roadrunner in the black. What's really interesting is this area here in southern Sonora, Mexico, because the ranges of the 2 species of Roadrunner overlap, and no one's ever seen what a lesser Roadrunner does when it sees a Greater Roadrunner. It probably runs for its life because it's smaller, I'm not sure. Oh, and I did want to mention a couple things, too. The range of the Roadrunner is expanding. It is now found all the way up in the northern part of the Sacramento Valley. When I was born, it was not found that far north. And it also has moved into Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri. And it was not there in the year I was born, so they've expanded also to the eastward. So Roadrunners are expanding, and it does look like the Roadrunner will probably benefit from global warming, because as our western United States gets more arid, it's going to dry out, the spaces are going to open up, and it will be more habitable by lizards, which are Roadrunners' favorite prey. So Roadrunners will probably benefit from global warming. Now this is, I'm going to give you two words that will be on the test that we give everyone here at the end of the program. The first is zygodactylous feet. Any bird that has zygodactylous feet has 2 toes pointing forward and 2 pointing backwards, all right? Parrots have that, woodpeckers have that, and roadrunners and all members of the cuckoo family have that characteristic. So that's one of the hallmarks of a roadrunner. I love this picture because you can see the X-shaped tracks that it makes, quite unique on the ground. Woodpecker tracks would be much, much smaller. You probably wouldn't even notice them as an X in the sand. You might wonder, how did he get this picture of the roadrunner with all those nice tracks? Well, I used a broom, and I swept the wash to make it very smooth, and then I invited a roadrunner, gave him a little bait, attracted him to where I was standing, and he ran all around trying to get the food and left those nice tracks. So these scenes, whether actual or recreated, depict authenticated occurrences. And there he's holding up his foot just so you can see the, you might say, gosh, did Jim train that bird to do that? Actually, he's being bitten by an ant, and he's picking the ant off his foot. And there's that close-up of the feet. So we call that zygodactylous toe pattern, 2 forward, 2 backward. Other characteristic of the roadrunner would be the very long tail and the head crest. There we go, okay. So a long tail, typical of cuckoos in general, and then the head crest, which not all cuckoos have. And we'll talk more about the head crest in a little bit. Now, here's the second word. Okay, zygodactylous feet, all of you have committed that to memory. Now you need to commit this one, the post-orbital patch. The orbit is our eye socket on our skull, same with a roadrunner, and that's those are the colors right behind the eye. White, blue, and orange, right behind the eye of the roadrunner. We call that the post-orbital patch. In this case, it's a void that has no feathers, and the roadrunner can part what feathers that are there and dramatically show the colors behind the eye there. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means when the roadrunner does that. You can see a little bit better there. It's a way the roadrunner has of expressing its emotional state. We make facial configurations when we're unhappy or sad or angry or whatever the case might be. The roadrunner exposes the post-orbital patch. And I put in one to help you remember what it means. Essentially, the best way I can put it is don't mess with me. When a roadrunner shows those colors, particularly if it allows those colors to show for a long time, keeps all the feathers away, that means that it's angry, okay? It's in a very heightened state of alert, and they'll do that in a wide variety of circumstances when they're attacking rattlesnakes, if another roadrunner comes into their territory. In fact, I should tell you a story. Years ago, when we were doing some active field research with roadrunners, we wanted to find out how roadrunners interact when another roadrunner comes into its territory. And you can't chase roadrunners from one territory to go into another one. They won't do it. So what we did is I spent $450 to make a stuffed roadrunner from a roadrunner that had been hit and killed by a car. We stuffed it $450, and then we took it out into the environment where we knew there was a pair of roadrunners to see what the pair of roadrunners would do. So we put it out there, backed away 10 feet. Within 2 or 3 seconds, both the male and female roadrunner that occupied the territory attacked my stuffed roadrunner, and within 15 seconds had shredded it into a zillion pieces. $450 gone in 5 seconds. We on the stuffed Roadrunner, we made sure that the post-orbital patches were showing and easily visible, and the pair that occupied that territory were not very happy with that. Another characteristic of Roadrunners, and not necessarily other cuckoos, is they have these very short, rounded wings. In fact, the wings are almost, the best way to describe a Roadrunner wing would be stumpy in comparison with other birds. I think I have a slide here where, okay, there's the Roadrunner on the far right there. A bird that weighs the same as a Roadrunner, about 12 ounces. A bird that would weigh that much would normally have a wing that long. Okay, that's what you would expect from a bird the size of a Roadrunner, but in fact, it has this very short, stumpy wing. Not very impressive at all. And so pretty much the Roadrunners, the only thing they can do is glide. Now, if you really press them, they might flap a little bit, get into the air, 10, 12 feet, not any higher than that. And then after 5, 6 seconds, they stop flapping and then they glide back down to the ground. You've probably seen them do that. We were curious to know just how long a Roadrunner could glide safely to the ground. So we took one up 5,000 feet in an airplane, and then we threw him out of the plane, and he glided for about 15 seconds, and then he dropped to the ground like a stone. No, we didn't do that. I would never do that. But they would drop to the ground like a stone. The longest glided flight I ever saw was in Big Bend National Park. A Roadrunner was following me on the trail, and they often do that to people because as we go down a trail, we're scaring up insects, grasshoppers and other insects, which then the Roadrunner captures and feeds upon. They would follow me or you just like they would a steer going through the environment. Not that we're steers, but any large thing will usually cause a lot of insects to fly into the air. Anyway, eventually he ran over to a cliff and he launched himself off the cliff and dropped about 500 feet. I timed it. It was 16 seconds it took him to get down there, and then he almost had kind of a crash landing. But that was the longest glide that I've ever seen a Roadrunner do. If you looked at the skeleton of a Roadrunner, or any bird, you'd see this large keel bone on the breastbone of any bird, and that's where the large flight muscles are attached. Roadrunner has no keel bone whatsoever. So they would have as weak a flight muscles as any bird could possibly have. So 15 seconds sustained glide is the max. After that, they do crash. In order to get that picture, we actually had to throw the Roadrunner up into the air, one of the ones we raced, and then he would glide down. It's hard to get that. Now, like humans, and by the way, humans make the greatest array of sound of any species of animal on planet Earth. We really have the vocal cords. We can whistle, we can call, we can imitate other people, imitate other animals. In fact, I'm going to guess that most of you would like to hear my imitation of a male Roadrunner's call during the breeding season. Is that to say? Okay. Okay, my wife's not here, so I can do that. She gets really embarrassed when I do that. Maybe it attracts her. Maybe I have to. Anyway, so go, and you'll hear this spring. Whoop, it's just a bottle of water. It's plastic. You'll hear it this spring, starting right now. A male will get on top of your house or on top of a large shrub, and they'll make the call like this. It goes, ooh, 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 ooh. Have you heard that? Some of you heard it? Yeah, that's the male, and he's trying to either attract a female if he doesn't have a mate yet, or if he does have a mate, he's trying to scare away other males to stay out of his territory. So that's kind of how it works. Anyway, now you've heard it, and that's the vocal. They make a lot of other sounds, bill clattering, a whole bunch of sounds, but that's the one that you hear in the springtime by the male, and there's one calling right now. They sound better than I do, but nonetheless. Okay, going to talk a little bit, there's some controversy surrounding this, but I would argue that of all the wild animals I have ever known, the Roadrunners are most accepting of humans. And I'm going to show you some pictures to indicate just how true that statement is. There's our Roadrunner. Here's a wild Roadrunner coming up to a resident of the Coachella Valley. Now, this lady's feeding the Roadrunner hamburger, which you're not supposed to do. If a male or female Roadrunner that have chicks in the nest, if they take a little ball of hamburger and feed it to their chick, that almost guarantees that the chick will be deformed. Usually, their bones in the legs do not form properly, and if you're a Roadrunner with a gimpy leg, you're not going to live very long. So if you insist on feeding Roadrunners, you have two choices. You can go down to Big Five or any pet store and buy mealworms. They're not really worms, they're the larva of a beetle. And you can buy those, and they have 12 of the 16 essential amino acids that Roadrunners need, and you can feed them the live mealworms. Or you can freeze the mealworms in the freezer, and they'll probably eat dead ones too. But you may not want to do either one of those. If you don't want to do that, then go to the pet store and buy a live mouse. Nobody wants to do that either. But I can tell you that if you go down and buy a mouse at the pet store and you give it to the Roadrunner, that Roadrunner will come in your yard every day for the rest of the Roadrunner's life. So they'll be very happy with you. I had a guy named Jerry who lived in Del Webb in Thousand Palms, and he would go down and buy 10 mice every week and feed them to the Roadrunner. And of course, Roadrunners, the live mouse has all the essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins that a Roadrunner needs. So if you're interested in doing that. Mealworms are a little bit more acceptable. Some of you probably have used mealworms as fish bait. So it's not too unappetizing, I guess. Here's another one. This lady thought that if she fed the Roadrunner tenderloin steak, that would be healthier for the Roadrunner. In fact, it's even worse because it doesn't have enough fat. And so both, tenderloin steak, these things don't work. They must eat whole animals. So if you're going to feed the Roadrunner, feed it a whole animal. That's the key. And they do like live animals too. This is my favorite picture. This is a wild Roadrunner. One of my neighbors lived about a block away, and he knew that I was studying Roadrunners, so he said, "Jim, you should come see the Roadrunner at my house." He opens his front door every morning, and within 15 to 30 minutes, a Roadrunner comes in his house, patrols the entire house. He lives in a one-floor house, finds maybe a cricket, maybe if the Roadrunner's lucky, a cockroach or something. And then it comes in and visits him. He's standing on his printer there, and that's when he took the picture. This happens every day, every day. This is a wild bird, and I don't know of any other wild animal species that would do something like this. So Roadrunners really are accepting of people. This is kind of a funny photograph. The biggest problem I have in photographing Roadrunners is getting them to stay far away from the camera. Huge problem. They come so often they come right up to you. This photograph was taken in a wash on the north side of the living desert where I spent quite a while photographing Roadrunners. This is my favorite one. That's my rather bulbous stomach there, my feet, and that's the female. She's standing on my stomach because I put mealworms on my chest, which she has already eaten, just to get that picture. Here's a better one. This is Boris Becker, so this photograph was taken quite a few years ago. But at the Indian Wells tennis tournament, Roadrunner came out on the court. Now, Boris Becker's like 6'3", 6'4", very big tennis player. He was frightened of the Roadrunner. He almost left the court. And so the Roadrunner ran around the tennis court for a while, and eventually, I'm not sure how he got out of the stadium, but he did. But they're just not afraid of people. Now, like humans, Roadrunners are technically omnivores. They certainly like a diet rich in meat, but they also will eat some plant material. Now, you might say, well, what kind of animals do Roadrunners eat? And here's the criteria. A Roadrunner will eat any animal that it can subdue. So that includes a tarantula that you see here. In this particular case, poor tarantula, This is a male. He's walking around in the fall looking for a mate, and he ran into a roadrunner. The roadrunner decided it only wanted the torso of the tarantula, so he grabbed all 8 legs separately, individually, took them all off, and then he ate the torso of the tarantula. Don't try that at home. Now, this roadrunner was part of one of our experiments, and he's got some mealworms in his bill. You can see those. And they're the mealworms, but he also had a scorpion that he had captured. This is a female. She's taking these back to her offspring. She's going to feed her child a scorpion. What kind of parent would do that? This one has a desert iguana. It killed the desert iguana. I'm not sure if it could eat that. That was a big desert iguana. They have been known to attack tortoises, but they've never been able to. They don't eat them because the shell, even for a hatchling tortoise, is so hard and leathery that roadrunners just won't even attempt to swallow them. They're too bulky. So they get away with surviving in spite of roadrunner presence. Roadrunners attack and eat snakes, of course, as probably most of you know. They approach every snake as though it's highly venomous. So this is a leaf-nosed snake, quite harmless, but the roadrunner acts as though it were a rattlesnake and its bite would be deadly, because roadrunners are not immune to the venom of a venomous snake. They would die quite quickly if they were ever bitten. Now this is a rattlesnake. This is a small red diamond rattlesnake, and can't really tell in this picture, but the rattlesnake had just struck at the roadrunner, and the roadrunner just jumped straight up in the air. And of course, the tail feathers, even if the rattlesnake would have struck the tail feathers, they're not living tissue, and so the roadrunner wouldn't have been hurt by that. Typically, they will use their wings as kind of the cape of a matador. They'll hold them out, trying to get the rattlesnake to strike at the wings. Again, harmless feathers. And in fact, the roadrunner really must have the rattlesnake strike at it. A roadrunner cannot kill any snake if the snake doesn't strike at it. So the roadrunner does all kinds of things to elicit the strike. Here's one, he's kicking at the sidewinder, trying to get the sidewinder to strike him, to strike out at him. They're so quick, they always miss the fangs. And then here's an image, and this was just after the sidewinder struck. The roadrunner grabs the rattlesnake in the middle of its strike with its mouth open. Usually they get a hold of the top of the head. And then they hold on to that and don't let go, and then start beating the rattlesnake over and over and over again on the ground until its vertebral column is broken in many, many places. In fact, we x-rayed one of the snakes that had been killed by a roadrunner. Its vertebral column, after it was done beating it on the ground, was broken in 16 places, effectively paralyzing the snake completely. And then they swallow them. So here he's got the upper jaw again of the rattlesnake, and that's the hold they're looking for. Gosh, you have to be fast to do that. And there he's now killed, or at least paralyzed, the sidewinder, and this particular roadrunner carried it off and gave it to its young, which of course could not swallow the entire snake at one time. I should tell you, a lot of times you'll see roadrunners running around with a lizard tail hanging out of their mouth, or a snake hanging out of its mouth. They can't swallow it all at once, so they swallow the front half, and then as that is digested, then they swallow another couple inches until finally, after several hours, the entire snake has been consumed by the roadrunner. This is not something you'd want to do when you're over at somebody's house having dinner, but this is standard operating procedure for the roadrunner. Now, we need to talk about roadrunner enemies, because they do have them. Wile E. Coyote, we've seen in the cartoon. Are coyotes a predator of roadrunners? And the answer is no. Don't base your knowledge on what you see in cartoons. I suppose I don't need to say that, but just in case. roadrunners are too fast and elusive to be captured by a coyote. Has it ever happened? Oh, I suppose in the history of roadrunners and coyotes, a coyote occasionally might get maybe once in its life might capture a live or running roadrunner by ambush or something, but it's very unusual. And when we find roadrunner bones in the scat of a coyote, it's more likely than not it was a roadrunner killed by a car and then the coyote scavenged it on the roadway rather than the coyote actually catching it. The biggest and most important predators of roadrunners are hawks and falcons. So typically a roadrunner will be looking up in the sky for its enemies because that's where the most important predators of roadrunners come from, would be the sky. Now this series of photographs I'm showing you now occurred in that same wash on the north side of the Living Desert in Palm Desert. And there was a Cooper's hawk there, in this case a juvenile Cooper's hawk, that would fly down the wash every morning. And I was there for 4 months every single day studying and taking photographs of the roadrunners. And the hawk would come by and he would try to capture a roadrunner, which was very difficult. Roadrunners typically would then go under the brush, into the bushes, and use that as shelter from the attack of the Cooper's hawk. One time the Cooper's hawk decided that, well, if he lands on the ground, he'll chase the roadrunner down instead of trying to attack it from the air. And so it's quite funny because the hawk, they can't run, they jump, they bound. And the hawk started chasing the roadrunner around and around and around a Palo Verde tree. This was in the early summer. Eventually, the hawk got so exhausted it just had to stop there on the ground, panting. Just couldn't catch the roadrunner. It was futile an attempt. So after that episode, the hawk then went out on the open ground and slowly flew up into the air and down the wash. And the roadrunner chased the hawk down the wash because it wanted to do that again. And in fact, the hawk came back and it happened a second time and around another Palo Verde tree. And then the hawk eventually flew off. But the roadrunner seemed to enjoy being chased in a situation where it knew it, as long as it knows where the hawk is, it could easily escape predation. Now, that particular roadrunner was part of a mated pair, male and a female, and those roadrunners had 4 chicks. And one of the chick got this bright idea of standing on top of that chain link fence so it could see mom and dad coming back with food before its siblings. And then it would get fed first. And that worked very well for about 3 days, at least the 3 days that I saw. On the 4th day, the little guy got up on top of the fence, and lo and behold, the Cooper's hawk came by and actually got him. That's the young roadrunner that the Cooper's hawk has captured. And then the Cooper's hawk went into a nearby cottonwood tree where it fed on the young roadrunner. The moral of that story is wait your turn, stay in the bushes, and don't sit on top of a chain link fence. The parents are used to being attacked by aerial predators, but the young are not. And that's the advantage of experience. Now, like humans, roadrunners pair for life. I had to put that in parentheses, but anyway. Roadrunners actually have more mate fidelity than humans do on average. When they find a mate, all the studies that have been come into fruition at this time, all of them have shown that roadrunners stay together for life. Once they find a mate, that's it. And only upon the death of their mate will they then go out and choose and find another mate. So we say that they're monogamous and they pair for life. So it's not unusual to see 2 roadrunners at one time. And when you do, particularly this time of year before young have left the nest, it's always a male and a female. And people always ask me, well, how do you tell the difference? There's only one way you can tell which one is the male and which one is the female. And let's, oh wait, I don't want to say that. I don't want to go there yet. Only one way you can tell, and that is that the male, when they're mating, will be the bird on top. Unless it's before March 1st. The females, they start producing female hormones earlier than the male starts producing male hormones. So anytime before March 1st, if two roadrunners are hanging around together, it will be the female that will become sexually aggressive, and she will mount the male, which of course doesn't result in any chicks. But that will happen until the male's hormones starts getting even with the females, and then they get it right. But that is interesting that was observed in several mated pair of roadrunners. Okay. Now, this is what I call the diamond ring phenomenon. A female roadrunner will not mate with a male unless he brings a gift. And it can't just be any gift. Sometimes male will collect some leaves and twigs, nesting material, and they'll try to offer it to the female so she'll mate with him. She will never mate, at least in the early spring, with a male just because he's bringing her nesting material. That's not the right kind of gift. Has to be something more valuable. The best thing to bring the female is a vertebrate animal, okay, a lizard, a snake, a small rodent, because those animals have complete nutritional value for the female and eventually the young. She needs to know that he can bring in the top of the food chain, most nutritious meals before she'll mate with him, because she's going to be laying eggs, they're going to have babies, and she needs to know that he can bring in the right stuff. Now, what's really interesting is that after mating, and it just takes a few seconds, they put the cloacal openings together, she's fertilized, and then she reaches up and she grabs the present, the gift, and he gives it to her, she eats it, and now she knows that he's a good provider. Now, that's what happens in the spring. I went to Tucson, Arizona, and spent an entire summer there watching to see what roadrunners would do in Tucson, Arizona during the summertime, because there they get summer rainfall. And roadrunners breed not just once, but they breed again in early July and late July and August and some September and sometimes even early October. But what I found there is that after the initial breeding season in the spring, when the female reaches up to grab the present, the male runs off with it. He is far less likely to, once they've been together for several months, he's far less likely to give her the food, and it makes her very angry. I've seen him, the female chases the male around and around for 15 minutes because she feels, hey, look, I have earned this. And it's curious because the deeper you go into the breeding season in Tucson, the less food the female gets after mating. The male keeps it for himself. Interesting. I'm not making any parallels or comparisons with that. Now, this is the result of mating, 5 eggs. That's a typical clutch for roadrunners. This is a typical nest of a roadrunner in a cholla cactus. They love nests there. There's actually a nest there. It's right in there. I think I have an arrow that I put in. Yeah, it's right in there. And this is where the nest is, and it's a great fortress. No predator, no Cooper's hawk, no snake, no coyote. They are not going into that golden cholla to get the eggs or the young after the young hatch. It's the perfect place, and that's their favorite nesting site. And there's the baby roadrunners, and I'm impressed that you think they're cute. Most people don't. They're, what can I say? But they have big red mouths, which helps guide the parents so that the parent knows where to put the food. Now, roadrunners have, I'm going to give you a third term, actually. They have what's called asynchronous hatching. That means that unlike house finches and mockingbirds, where the eggs pretty much all hatch on the same day, roadrunner eggs hatch every couple of days. So you have a big roadrunner in the nest that is always noticeably larger than the other one. So this was the first one to hatch, and this one was the last one to hatch. And there's still some eggs that haven't hatched in that particular nest. This is a problem because roadrunner parents usually can provide enough food for 3 or 4 young at the most. I have never seen, at least any of the Roadrunners I've studied, none of them have been able to successfully rear more than 4 chicks. And yet there can be 5, 6, 7 eggs, all of which will hatch. This is really not good. If you are the last Roadrunner to hatch, you will be devoured by the largest sibling in the nest. I'm glad we don't do that in our society. Where's your little brother? Oh, we ate him. Yeah. And it sounds horrible, but what it does is it guarantees that at least 4 of the offspring will grow up and into full-size Roadrunners, leave the nest, and start a new Roadrunner colony of their own someplace. So without that, there would be one meal not available to the other siblings. Some people think that the parents may feed the smallest one to their siblings, but in any event, the only thing we really know is we visit a nest, there are 5 chicks in the nest, we come back the next day, there are 4. And there's no dead one around on the ground or anything, and the biggest one doesn't seem to be hungry. So here's mom and dad on the nest. I'm not sure you can see it very well. There's actually a little guy under there in a cholla cactus, photograph taken at Smoke Tree Ranch. And you might say, wow, look he's got a photograph of one of the parents feeding a lizard, in this case a zebra-tailed lizard, to the young. And you might say, isn't that hard to get a photograph like that? Not really, because that position that both of them are in lasted over 5 minutes. Because the parent is not just giving food to the young, it's regurgitating water. And that's how they hydrate their young, is by giving them food, get their mouths open, and then they transfer water into the young as well. So that's keeps the young hydrated and surviving in a desert environment. Here's the male and female. Both of them have lizards. Can't see that one very well, but they're bringing lizards into the nest, and I happen to be sitting under the tree, and so they wanted me to leave before they would feed them, so I had to leave shortly after I took this picture. Okay, now here's another thing that's almost human. This is a young Roadrunner. He actually weighs more. This is the young Roadrunner. He actually weighs more than the parent, because the parent's running around, burning up calories, keeping nice and trim through the exercise of getting food for the young, and the young are just sitting around waiting to be fed. So typically at 18 days when they're 18 days old, about ready to leave the nest, they usually weigh more than the parents. What I found in my studies done in and around the living desert among the wild Roadrunners there was that the female will feed the young up to 3 months after it leaves the nest. But the male will only feed the young 3 days after they've left the nest. The mother has a soft touch for the young, so she keeps feeding them, and they just sit on the ground. I think maybe you can even tell that the baby is not much of a baby. It's actually bigger than the female at this point. The male forces them to get out of the house, so to speak, early, and the female lets them linger. I don't know if that's like humans or not. You'll have to answer that question yourself. Just to give you an idea of how old they are when you see them in the nest, these are 2 young. They are 12 days old. God help if this egg hatches now, because it'll never survive with siblings that are 12 days old and starting to get pretty big. 13 days, starting to get a little color there, that post-orbital patch. Here we have 15 days. This was one that I had hand-raised, and so that's why it's out of the nest. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like, I can't tell you how many young Roadrunners we hand-raised over the years, too many. And then we have one 18 days old, starting to look a little bit more like an adult now. So it gives you an idea of their size and how rapidly they grow. So by 18 days, they're ready to leave the nest and about the size of mom and dad. One of the reasons I started studying Roadrunners is that I was shocked when people kept coming up to me and saying, Jim, what happens to the Roadrunners in November? I said, nothing. They're resident birds. They don't migrate, so they're same places they've always been. But we don't see them anymore. We were feeding them every day until around mid-November, and then they just disappeared. And I said, well, maybe something killed them. They got hit by a car, cat got them, who knows what. Oh, no, because in the spring, the two came back, and we started seeing them again. I said, well, how do you know they were the same Roadrunners? Because they came into our house, they jumped on the drain board in the kitchen, and we fed them like we did the other ones. So the behavior clearly indicated they were the same Roadrunners. But what happens to Roadrunners in the wintertime? We found that observations of Roadrunners decline about 90% in the middle of November. I'm not saying you never see them again after that. And then around February 15th, the same individuals reappear and numbers go back up to normal. So they disappear in the depths of winter. What happens to them? They can't migrate, they don't fly far enough, and nobody sees hordes of Roadrunners running to Mexico in the fall. It never happens. There's a clue, though, as to what might be happening here. Have you ever seen Roadrunners do this? They turn their back to the sun, and they have this black skin on their back. And in the morning, particularly in the wintertime, they allow the sun to warm their body up, because the night before, they allow their body temperature to drop 20 to 30 degrees. They go into torpor every single night, like hummingbirds do. And they have the capacity to do this, to lower their body temperature, reduce their metabolic rate, and survive on a lot less food because they go into torpor every single night. Here's another one sunning itself. The advantage of doing this is that you have two choices. You can burn up calories to warm your body up, so you can be active if you're a warm-blooded creature, or if you're a Roadrunner, you can let the sun do it and save a lot of energy. Some estimates indicate that Roadrunners can save up to 50% of their energy by going into torpor every night and then letting the sun warm them up instead of burning calories to do that. There's one showing the dark skin on its back. Remember, black absorbs 25% more heat energy than white. And so by having black skin, they're going to absorb more heat, and they're letting the sun do the work that would normally be done by burning food energy. Do Roadrunners hibernate like the porwheel? This is a hibernating porwheel. They hibernate for anywhere from 3 to 4 months out in the open and exposed in this area, and they hibernate to save energy because porwheels feed on insects, and there just aren't any insects to feed on at night, which is a normal feeding time for this porwheel. Porwheel is the only bird in the world definitely known to hibernate, and they hibernate right here in the Coachella Valley. So we needed to find out if Roadrunners hibernated. So we got some radio tracking equipment, and we got these little transmitters, and the idea was that we would affix one to the back of a Roadrunner and then find out where they go in the wintertime. We had a problem, though. We were not able, in 2 years of trying, we couldn't trap a Roadrunner in early November using live bait in these live traps that we built at great expense. We're not sure why that was, but the reason we had to trap it in November was that at that time, the battery life was 2 months. So if we trapped it, in April, when we probably could have gotten them when they had young, by the time fall rolled around, the radio battery would be completely exhausted. So at that time, we had to do it in the fall, find out what they would do. And you might say, well, who cares if Roadrunners hibernate? What difference does it make? It makes a lot of difference to all of us here because there are a lot of surgical procedures still used today where doctors will lower your body temperature 10 or even 20 degrees by sending your blood through a cooling machine and then sending it back into the patient, which gives them much longer time period to do complicated surgery with less complications because you're in effect in torpor during the surgery rather than having a high metabolic rate where if something goes wrong, it's going to go wrong much faster than if the patient is in torpor. So anything we might learn from Roadrunners hibernating could have applications to our own species because someday we may need to hibernate. If we're ever going to reach the most distant galaxies, we're going to have to be put in torpor. There's just no other way to do it. And what we learn from the porwheel and the roadrunner will tell us much about hibernating animals and how we someday can apply what we learn in those species of wildlife to our own selves, not just in surgery, but also in any situation that requires we be placed in torpor for long periods of time. That ends the program. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have now. Thank you. Thank you very much. And what I'll do is I'll raise your hand if you have a question, and then I'll point to you. This lady in front, yes.
Where do they hibernate?
Okay. Question is, where do roadrunners hibernate? Nobody knows, because no roadrunner has actually been found hibernating yet. That's why we wanted to put the radio transmitters on them, was so that we could find what they were doing in December and January. But we failed in our attempt, and after 2 years of trying, I moved on to another research project. So some young scientist is going to pursue this, and now the batteries last 6 months. So you can trap a roadrunner almost any time of year and find out what it's doing in the wintertime. Yes, right here.
Okay, so is there a difference in their male and female in the way they relate to you? I've got mine, who's been there now for 6 or 8 months. He disappeared for 3 weeks in the cold, and now he's back again, and now he's going to mate. I can hear her out in the watch. Will the males be more aggressive at first?
You can't tell roadrunners apart by just looking at them, so you have to see them mating after March 1st. Then you know for sure. Now, once you see that, then most roadrunners will have some kind of distinguishing feature, a little notch in the bill maybe, missing feathers on part of its body, it's hard to say. But once you can identify them, and I was able to do that with a number of roadrunners that I studied, in my experience, I found the female roadrunners were even more accepting of humans than the male was. For example, the roadrunner on my stomach, that was the female. The male would not do that, even though I would put bait on my chest because I wanted to get that kind of fun picture. Males would not do that. And I found that to be true for about 7 pairs of roadrunners that I studied in detail. Whether that's true throughout, I'm not sure. And when we put the stuffed roadrunner out, the male and female attacked the stuffed roadrunner with equal vigor. So I can't really say that, and those are really anecdotal observations. Yes, right here. Lifespan of the roadrunner. The longest roadrunner that has ever been found in the wild, the oldest I should say, was 8 years old. He was It was banded when it had just left the nest, and then those same biologists found the roadrunner 8 years later. It had been hit by a car on the road in Big Bend National Park. And it was 8 years old when that happened. In captivity, they can live at least 12 years. Most animals in captivity live longer than they would in the wild for, I think, obvious reasons. But that would be typical age. Yes, back there, right here. Yeah, you're... Question is, I had mentioned that I raised roadrunners. Did we steal them out of the nest? No. During the height of our research, we were brought roadrunner eggs and roadrunner young all the time when the gardeners were trimming plants and trees, and they would cut it, and the nest would fall to the ground, and the eggs that didn't break were brought into us, and we had an incubator. And sometimes it would be young, and so we raised those. So I was the father of the roadrunners to all intents and purposes, which really, you learn a lot more about animals when you raise them. There's so many stories to tell, like the time the roadrunner chased the housekeeper out into the street because she didn't know we had one in the house, but we'll tell. Yes, back there, yes. Question is, doesn't the Roadrunner have ill effects when it swallows a venomous snake or a black widow? Also, they love to eat black widows. The answer is no. For the same reason that if I could drink rattlesnake venom, and more likely than not, my digestive juices would just dissolve the venom, which is very complex protein molecules, into harmless protein components. And the Roadrunner, same thing for the Roadrunner. If I have an open wound in my mouth or throat or something, then that would be a different story. But venoms are meant to be injected into the bloodstream. Taken orally, they are usually harmless, completely harmless. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and drink rattlesnake venom. But that's the bottom line. Other questions? Yes, right here in front. Question is, do Roadrunners engage in play? Most definitely, yes. I kind of suggested that in that one incident where the Roadrunner was trying to attract the Cooper's hawk to attack it so it could outmaneuver and escape it by running around the Palo Verde tree. Most animals that have been studied, I'm talking about vertebrate animals, so birds and mammals, not reptiles so much, all play. Play is practice for the vagaries of an adult life. And then some of us play games even as adults. I just watched a horrible one on television last Sunday. But most of the time it's for juveniles, not adults. Yes, over here.
Roadrunner lives to be 8 years old. What age do they reproduce?
Roadrunners reproduce the first spring of their life. So when they're roughly 1 year of age, they are reproductively ready and they do breed. It's quite unlikely the female will never find a mate. Most of the available female Roadrunners almost always find a mate. And so they breed their very first year, and then every year thereafter, so far as we know. So the average Roadrunner probably reproduces, or fledges, I should say, young that leave the nest, somewhere in the order of 40 to 60 young during the course of their lives, average female. Yes, up front here. The question is the population of Roadrunners growing or declining? It seems to be growing. That's what I would say. In spite of the thousands and thousands of road kills every year, which is probably the most important mortality factor for Roadrunners, they seem to be doing really well in residential areas here in the Coachella Valley. Most domestic cats will not attack an adult Roadrunner because the adult Roadrunner becomes kind of aggressive around cats. They figured that out, that cats, our cats, let's face it, cats are wussies. We feed them out of a can. They're not really good at attacking prey that appears to be as large as the cat itself. So, so they're doing well in residential areas, and then their ranges are expanding to the east primarily because of golf course developments. You go into a wooded area and you clean it out, and now you've created Roadrunner habitat with the open fairways and the greens, and there's always a lot of insects around, and then they can go into the wooded areas to build their nests. So they're doing well. They shopping malls, they clear all the vegetation off, and now they create marginal habitat for Roadrunners. So they're doing pretty good. Yes, back there. Of course, herbicides are always a potential problem for wildlife. That being said, I have not ever heard or read of any specific issues with regards to Roadrunner. Now, that being said, probably the most growing threat to Roadrunners in residential areas is the use of rat poisons. I see them everywhere now. It's a potential problem because a mouse or rat goes inside that bait box, eats anticoagulant toxins, comes around, and it takes about 3 to 5 days to kill the rodent. Eventually that rodent then wanders around out onto the lawn and dies. Maybe the Roadrunner sees it while it's still moving a little bit, and then the Roadrunner eats it and the Roadrunner dies. So I can't tell you that greatest threat to Roadrunners, in fact, the greatest threat to all wildlife that might live in the interfaces would be the use of rat poisons. There are a lot of other ways to control small rodents. You don't need to use these poison bait boxes that I see everywhere. In the middle of downtown, you know, in a developed area, it's probably not an issue, but boy, on the margins of residential areas and natural desert interfaces, horrible problem, potentially. And that could be threatened roadrunners too. Yes? Roadrunners cannot live in the northern part of the country. And the reason for that, I suspect, is that if you go into hibernation, around here, you know, it gets down to 44 at night, maybe 36. If it does reach freezing, it's for a very brief period. The roadrunner can stay in torpor, not a big deal. You go into northern Nevada and you try to pull that off and the temperature drops below 0, that roadrunner is going to freeze to death. So it may very well be that the nightly torpor that roadrunners require and depend upon prevents them from going too far north, but now that's changing. Temperatures further north are a lot warmer than they used to be, and that's one of the reasons roadrunners have been able to move all the way to the northern part of the Sacramento Valley in California. It's not as cold as it used to be at that time, and they're expanding their range as a result of that. Yes? The question is, although roadrunners may be benefiting from some of the environmental changes we're seeing now, are there negative impacts? And the answer is definitely yes. I'm talking about roadrunners, but a lot of other animals and plants are not faring anywhere near as well as roadrunners are. The only thing I can offer is, in this day of environmental change, it's nice to at least once in a while hear about an animal that seems to be benefiting from the change that we're experiencing now. And the roadrunner would be one of those, but probably the other 999,000 are not benefiting. So, yes. Yes, right here in front. The question is, can roadrunners imprint on a person? I tried that many times, and the answer is no. All these stories. I raised a lot of roadrunners, and what I would do is I would feed them in the morning, I'd let them go outside, and then I would go to work. And then I'd come home at 5 o'clock, and for about 2 months, the roadrunner would be on the roof, you know, watching to see when I would come home, because then the roadrunner knew it would get fed. But I bet I did that probably 15 times with 15 different roadrunners, and every time, eventually, the roadrunners left. And then I'd see them once a week, and they'd come by, and I'd feed them, but they wouldn't stay. They wouldn't take the bait and allow themselves to become dependent upon me, which is a good thing. So they don't really imprint like so many other animals do. You've seen geese. Geese will follow people around, and then they want to mate with the person they've imprinted on when they become an adult. Roadrunners don't do that. Yes, back there. What happens to the animal once it's swallowed by the roadrunner? Gastric juices, our gastric juices can dissolve bone, as can the roadrunners. So the only thing that goes through the roadrunner's intestinal tract intact would be the teeth of rodents. They can't digest the teeth of rodents because of the enamel covering. That's pretty effective. But most everything else is digested. Hair is not digested, I should mention that. Feathers, partially digested. Most of the time when you see roadrunner droppings, though, it's hard to identify anything in the dropping, like you could with owl pellets, for example. 2 more questions, right over here. That's a good question. The question is, what was the selective stimulus that selected for the running ability over the flying ability? If you want to catch a lizard in the desert, you have to do it on the ground. And I think that most aerial predators have trouble catching lizards in particular, like kestrels and falcons and Cooper's hawks. It's a lot easier to capture the lizard if you can go in and out and under the brush to capture the lizard like roadrunners can. So I suspect It was the availability primarily of lizard prey that selected for an animal that could run fast rather than one that could fly fast. And so over time, at least the last 4 million years that we know roadrunners have been around, they have become the ground predator, the kind of the equivalent, if you will, of a falcon, but on the ground. And they can chase down prey that otherwise couldn't be successfully captured from the air. That would be the selective pressure. That I feel confident in saying that, though I wasn't there to watch it. One more question. Yes, in front. Two questions. Do they reuse the nest? And do the male and female share an egg incubation duties? And that's a very good question. They don't usually use the same nest 2 years in a row. I have seen it happen on one occasion, but most of the times it's a new nest, primarily because the old nest is infested with lice eggs. And so you don't want to go back to the old nest because now you'll have a double dose of lice, which could become a problem for a particular young developing chick. The second question you had, though, is do parents share in the incubation duties? And that's a very good question and a good question to end on, because females develop the eggs at great energetic cost for them. The male's just sitting around, but she's developing these eggs. And so after she lays the eggs over a period of up to 5 days, and then, in fact, when the first egg is laid till the last one is laid, at night, she gets to leave the nest. She goes into torpor, which saves her energy. The male, though, has to go in and incubate the eggs, and that's the only time in a year that a male does not go into torpor. He keeps his metabolic rate high so he can incubate those eggs. And my wife, when she heard that, she thought that was the best arrangement she's ever heard about. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to autograph books.